Prologue: Why Egypt endured across more than 3 millennia. Egypt did not simply survive, it perfected the art of continuity. The pharaoh was not a monarch in the modern sense, but a living axis, Horus on earth, destined to become Osiris in death. Around that axis revolved the principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order. If the king upheld the sun crossed the sky, the Nile rose and fell on cue, fields germinated, courts judged fairly, and borders held. If he faltered, the world tilted toward disorder felt as drought, revolt, or the tramp of foreign armies. Kingship, in other words, was a cosmology with a human face. Geography gave this cosmology room to work. Egypt was a green ribbon shielded by emptiness, Sahara to the west, Eastern Desert and Red Sea to the east, Mediterranean to the north, cataracts to the south. Invaders could come, but only along narrow corridors that favored defenders and bought time. Within this cradle, the Nile's clockwork floods laid down black silt and a reliable agricultural surplus, the economic heartbeat that fed courts, temples, armies, and the scribes who recorded it all on papyrus. Institutional craft turned surplus into stability. Egypt built a bureaucracy before the word existed, surveyors and scribes measuring fields after each inundation, storehouses and granaries smoothing badgers, labor levies rotating peasants to royal projects, provincial officials checked by royal inspectors, priesthoods that bound local loyalties to national cults, ritual braided through administration, festivals, oracles, and jubilees renewed the king's mandate and stitched village life to the state's grand narrative. Ideology made continuity feel inevitable. Temples enacted the daily feeding of gods. The king smashed chaos in ritual combat. Tombs rehearsed resurrection with formulas and images that promised an Assyrian afterlife to anyone properly prepared. Writing itself, names carved in stone, decrees chiseled in temple shade, was a technology of permanence. Even in crisis, that habit of order pulled the pieces back together. Modern imagination, however, often mistakes spectacle for cruelty. One persistent myth claims pharaohs went to the tomb trailed by slain servants. In truth, by the Pyramid Age, the dead were accompanied by Hatshepsut, small, exquisitely crafted figurines inscribed to answer on behalf of the deceased in the fields of the afterlife. Early retainer burials did exist at the dawn of statehood, but the practice faded as funerary theology matured and symbolism replaced blood. Another myth paints the pyramids as mountains of misery raised by chained multitudes. Excavations at Giza tell a different story. Planned workers' towns with bakeries, breweries, cattle bones from rich rations, orthopedic care for injuries, and burials that honored laborers by name. Teams were organized, provisioned, and proud seasonal crews who gave corvée service when the fields lay under flood. Far from anonymous slaves, they were specialists in logistics, quarrying, hauling, and stone setting, the human intelligence behind the limestone. So Egypt endured by layering advantages, a river's metronome, deserts for walls, a surplus managed economy, a bureaucracy that remembered everything, a theology that made justice cosmic and renewal cyclical, and an aesthetic of stone that turned reigns into calendars of eternity. Empires came and went around it. Egypt's secret was simpler and harder to keep, and tomorrow becomes yesterday's echo. The idea of kingship and dynastic stability among the civilizations of the ancient world, none cultivated continuity with such precision and sacred purpose as Egypt. Where Mesopotamia shifted like silt under the footsteps of successive city kings, and where China cycled through dynasties forged and shattered by rebellion. Egypt pursued stability as a divine mandate. Kingship was not a political arrangement. It was the spine of the cosmos. The pharaoh was born not merely heir to a throne, but heir to creation, the living Horus, the embodiment of divine order, destined in death to become Osiris, steward of eternity. His rule was a ritual in motion. Coronations were not announcements of power but renewals of cosmic balance. Jubilee festivals did not celebrate longevity alone. They recharged the metaphysical engine of the kingdom, reaffirming that the king's body and the body of Egypt were one. When the pharaoh left no son, the question was not ambition but cosmic continuity. Succession reached inward. 2 brothers, daughters, royal wives, keeping the divine bloodline unbroken. Only rarely did a woman ascend as sovereign, yet when she did, as in the case of Hatshepsut, she bore the full regalia of kingship, transforming tradition rather than transgressing it. In Egypt, legitimacy flowed from ritual as much as from lineage. Long reigns were common, not accidental. Each pharaoh's authority extended across all realms of life. He shaped religion, opened or sealed temples, raised armies, dictated diplomacy, commanded monumental works, and even set the fashion. The silhouette of the state reflected the silhouette of its king. Stone and statecraft were bound. To build was to rule. To command stone was to command time. Such was the theological gravity of pharaohship that even conquerors bowed to it. When Persians arrived, they assumed the sacred titulary, presenting themselves to the people and priesthood not as foreign tenants, but as chosen bearers of Nat. The Romans, as conquerors of the known world, did likewise. Egypt was too ancient to govern by force alone. It required participation in a cosmic office. The age of divine kings ended with Cleopatra VII, the last sovereign to wear the double crown. Yet Egypt did not surrender its memory. It folded its history into limestone and ritual ink. Every unearthed tomb, every deciphered relief widens the doorway into that long daylight where kings ruled not because they conquered, but because the universe demanded governance, because without the pharaoh, the world risked falling back into the dark waters of the beginning. In Egypt, power was not seized. It was inherited from the gods, borrowed for a lifetime, and returned to eternity. To lands become one in Narmer and the unification of Egypt. And before Egypt became a single kingdom, the Nile was a corridor divided to lands, to crowns, to souls. In the south stretched Upper Egypt, narrow and austere, a land of warriors, hunters, and hilltop shrines. In the north lay Lower Egypt, the wide and fertile delta, where cities rose among lagoons, and the horizon dissolved into reeds and water. For centuries, these realms mirrored each other, trading, quarreling, merging faiths, until a single will bound them under one sky. That will belong to Narmer, known in later chronicles as Menes, the first to wear both the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north. His name marks the dawn of recorded history. On the Narmer palette, carved around 3100 BCE, he stands like a bridge between worlds. On one side, striking down enemies in the name of divine order. On the other, already crowned as the ruler of the united land. Above him hover sacred emblems, Horus the falcon god, papyrus and lotus entwined, the living symbols of two realms becoming one. For a long time, scholars saw in this image only conquests, the triumph of the sword. Yet the stones whisper of something more intricate. The unification of Egypt was not a single battle, but a long symphony of diplomacy, marriage, and sacred ritual. Temples were aligned to reflect the twin currents of the Nile. Cults of local gods were fused into a single cosmic pantheon. The goddess Nekhbit of the south and Wadjet of the north became the two ladies, protectors of one throne. The dual crowns were bound together, not melted, but interwoven. Even the myths of Narmer's death carry the scent of symbol. Some say he was taken by a crocodile or slain by a hippopotamus, creatures of the Nile's chaos, embodying the eternal struggle between order and the untamed. Whether allegory or memory, the story mirrors the pharaoh's destiny, to master the waters, and in doing so, to risk being consumed by them. From this act of unity rose Memphis, the first true capital, placed precisely where the rivers to lands met. There, between desert and delta, Narmer founded more than a city. He founded an idea. Egypt would be one body, one faith, one heartbeat. And the pharaoh gets mind. He did not simply rule a country. He created the horizon where heaven and earth agreed to meet. Crisis and restoration. Khasekhemwy. Even in its dawn, Egypt's unity trembled. The Nile, though it bound the land together, also divided it. Upper and Lower Egypt remained two souls within one body, forever testing the strength of their bond. The later kings of the Second Dynasty inherited this tension, and the fragile new kingdom swayed between divine order and the shadow of chaos. Civil strife erupted, temples closed, nomes rebelled, and even the royal titulary fractured. One pharaoh dared to call himself the son of Seth rather than Horus, a name that sent a shiver through the ideology of kingship itself. For Seth was the god of storms and division, the eternal rival of light. From this turmoil arose Khasekhemwy, the ruler destined to heal what had been torn apart. His inscriptions tell of violent suppression, tens of thousands slain in battle, but his legacy is not merely one of conquest. When the fighting ended, he did not crown himself as a victor of men, but as a reconciler of gods. His new royal name, Khasekhemwy, means the two powers appear, a union of Horus and Seth, the sky and storm, order and chaos restored to harmony. In his name, Egypt found its first theology of balance, the understanding that unity endures not by erasing conflict, but by transforming it into equilibrium. Khasekhemwy ruled as both warrior and architect of renewal. He fortified Egypt's frontiers, re-established control over the delta, and began to bind the kingdom through infrastructure of roads, fortresses, and administrative centers that would later define the Old Kingdom. His tomb at Abydos, built of colossal mud brick walls, stands as the prototype of what would soon evolve into the pyramids of the first gesture toward eternity rendered in clay before the age of stone. He also struck a quiet blow against the growing power of the priesthoods. By reclaiming temple lands for the crown, he reaffirmed that divine order flowed through the pharaoh, not around him. In this, Khasekhemwy set the pattern for all later kings, priest and general, judge and builder of the axis on which Egypt's world would turn. When his reign ended, Egypt stood once more whole. The storms of Seth had subsided. Horus had reclaimed the sky. And yet, in Khasekhemwy's double name, Egypt kept the memory of its danger, a warning carved into the very idea of kingship, that the kingdom's strength was not in silence, but in balance, not in conquest, but in reconciliation. He was the first to understand that peace, in Egypt, was not the absence of conflict, it was the mastery of opposites. The Old Kingdom begins with Djoser and Imhotep around 2686 BC. Egypt crossed a threshold from the experimental age of mud and clay into an era of divine permanence. This was the birth of the Old Kingdom, the age of pyramids, when kings no longer merely ruled the land but sought to eternalize their reign in stone. At its dawn stood Pharaoh Djoser, and beside him, the visionary who turned faith into form, Imhotep. Imhotep was more than an architect. He was priest, physician, astronomer, and philosopher, the first recorded genius in human history. Later generations would revere him as a god of wisdom, the Egyptian Hermes, the mind that first understood how geometry could imitate eternity. Where others built to bury, Imhotep built to ascend. The step pyramid of Saqqara, rising above the desert plateau, was his revelation. Before Djoser, kings rested beneath mastabas, flat, rectangular tombs of mud brick, humble dwellings for immortal souls. Imhotep dared to imagine a stairway to the divine, one mastaba placed atop another, 6 levels high, each diminishing as it reached upward, until it became a mountain of light. The structure shimmered in white limestone under the desert sun, a man-made horizon, visible for miles, linking earth and sky. Yet the step pyramid was not just a tomb. It was an entire sacred complex, enclosed within vast limestone walls and laid out like a celestial city. Within its courts stood temples, chapels, shrines, and ceremonial halls, all echoing the architecture of the royal palace. Here, the king could continue the rituals of rule after death, maintaining cosmic order in the world beyond. Beneath the pyramid stretched a labyrinth of corridors, false shafts, and chambers, a symbolic underworld through which the pharaoh's soul would journey, shedding its earthly shell before ascending to the stars. In this single act of creation, Djoser and Imhotep changed the meaning of kingship forever. No longer was death an ending. It became an initiation. The pyramid was both fortress and prayer, its ascending layers of visual hymn to eternity. For the first time in history, human hands had shaped stone not for shelter, but for immortality. The step pyramid stood as Egypt's first manifesto in stone, declaring that divine order could be built, measured, and made visible. It was a silent theology, written in limestone, stating that the pharaoh was not merely remembered by the gods, he was one of them. Through Djoser's vision and Imhotep's genius, Egypt found its voice, a voice that spoke in geometry and sunlight, in harmony and silence. From this beginning, every later pyramid, from Sneferu's bold experiments to Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza, would trace its lineage back to that single, daring leap. The Old Kingdom began not with conquest, but with an idea that through wisdom, faith, and stone, a mortal life could touch eternity. Sneferu the Innovator toward the true pyramid. If Djoser and Imhotep dreamed of eternity, it was Sneferu, founder of the 4th dynasty, who taught Egypt how to build it. Under his reign, architecture turned from intuition into science, from sacred art into geometry guided by vision. His was an age of relentless experimentation, not of conquest or chaos, but of perfecting the means to defy time itself. Sneferu inherited the idea of the pyramid as a stairway to heaven. But he was not content with imitation, he sought perfection. His reign became a trilogy of transformation, each monument an experiment in how to anchor the divine within the earth. The first of these, the Medum Pyramid, began as a traditional step pyramid. Later, Sneferu ordered it to be refashioned into smooth sides, symbolizing the soul's seamless ascent toward the gods. Though much of its casing collapsed in later centuries, it was here that Egyptian builders learned to clothe raw steps in the illusion of celestial ascent, turning architecture into theology, stone into sunlight. The second great experiment, the bent pyramid at Djoser, remains one of Egypt's most haunting silhouettes. Its lower angle soars sharply before softening midway, bending as if the mountain itself hesitated between heaven and earth. Archaeologists see a change in design and adaptation to prevent collapse, but its form also speaks a deeper language, a symbol of transition, of the moment when human aspiration meets divine restraint. Beneath its broken geometry lies Egypt's first real understanding of load, stress, and slope, the birth of architectural physics. Sneferu's final creation, the Red Pyramid, was his triumph, the first true pyramid in history. Its smooth, perfect planes rise at the ideal angle that would later define Khufu's Great Pyramid. Its red limestone glows under the desert sun, as if lit from within, a reflection of eternity caught in stone. Here, at last, Egypt mastered the secret of immortality through engineering, a structure stable enough to last forever, yet graceful enough to speak to the gods. But Sneferu's greatness lay not only in stone. He expanded Egypt's frontiers. Expeditions to Nubia, Sinai, and the Levant carried cedar, copper, and gold back to the Nile. His fleets sailed the Red Sea, perhaps the first recorded maritime ventures in Egyptian history. He was both builder and conqueror, but his conquests were of harmony, precision, and order. To his people, Sneferu was a king of joy, beloved, approachable, radiant in myth. Later generations spoke of him not as a tyrant, but as a shepherd of men, a ruler who brought light where there had been labor. In him, Egypt saw the ideal pharaoh, both human and divine, both visionary and craftsman. And from his reign forward, every pyramid would carry his legacy, Every block of stone would echo the question Sneferu answered, can the human hand build something that will outlast time? His pyramids still stand as his reply, not merely yes, but eternally. Khufu and the Great Pyramid. When Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, ascended the throne, Egypt had already learned how to shape eternity. Yet he would demand more, not just permanence, but perfection. His reign, in the 26th century BC, produced the Great Pyramid of Giza, the most astonishing structure of the ancient world and still one of humanity's supreme enigmas. It rises from the desert like a geometry of divinity, its sides aligned with celestial precision, its base level within fractions of an inch, its summit once capped in gold, reflecting the light of Ra. For over 4,000 years it reigned as the tallest structure on Earth, built not by machines or magic, but by vision, mathematics, and the collective will of a civilization that believed stone could speak to the gods. The man behind the monument, to later historians like Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after Khufu's death, the king was a despot who enslaved his people and closed the temples. But Egyptian sources tell a gentler story, Khufu as a sovereign of divine order, a man who commanded obedience not through cruelty, but through cosmic duty. His pyramid was not an act of oppression, it was an offering to eternity. Builders of eternity. Modern archaeology has buried the myth of slave labor. Excavations around Giza revealed workers' villages, complete with bakeries, breweries, medical quarters, and dormitories for rotating crews. These were not chained captives but highly trained artisans, engineers, and laborers, fed well and buried with honor near their king. They worked in teams named after royal symbols, the Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Mentuhotep, and their graffiti still mark the inner stones. Whispers of pride carved into the heart of eternity. The Great Pyramid was the culmination of Sneferu's experiments, a masterwork of precision engineering. It contained over 2.3 million limestone and granite blocks, each weighing several tons, yet fitted so tightly that even a blade cannot pass between them. Its base covers more than 13 acres, and each side was aligned almost perfectly to the cardinal directions, an earthly mirror of the heavens. The inner mystery inside the pyramid is a labyrinth of deliberate complexity. A descending passage leads to an unfinished subterranean chamber, perhaps symbolizing the underworld. Higher lies the Queen's Chamber, serene and enigmatic, possibly representing the womb of rebirth. At the pyramid's heart, 43 meters above ground, rests the King's Chamber, constructed from massive granite slabs hauled from Aswan, monolithic blocks weighing up to 80 tons each. Above it, 5 relieving chambers distribute the immense pressure of millions of tons of stone. A triumph of architectural foresight. In 2017, scientists peered into Khufu's monument with WON tomography, a particle scanning technique that revealed an unknown void of vast, hidden space above the Grand Gallery. Its purpose remains unsolved. Was it a structural cavity, a symbolic chamber, or a sealed sanctum for the king's celestial journey? The Great Pyramid still guards its final secret, as if time itself conspired to protect its silence, the eternal symbol of whatever the hidden truths. Khufu achieved what no mortal had before or since. He commanded the earth to build him a mountain of eternity and succeeded. His pyramid was not only a tomb, but a cosmic engine, designed to ensure the sun's rising, the Nile's flooding, and the Pharaoh's rebirth among the stars. As dusk falls on the Giza Plateau, the Great Pyramid still absorbs the fading light, its colossal shadow stretching across millennia. It stands not merely as a monument to Khufu, but as the enduring proof that one human lifetime, aligned with vision and faith, can defy the limits of mortality. Man fears time, says an Arabic proverb, but time fears the pyramids, and nowhere is that truer than in the silent geometry Khufu left behind. Collapse of the Old Kingdom. The long reign of Pepi II. By the twilight of the 6th dynasty, the grandeur that had once raised the pyramids began to flicker. The divine order that had sustained Egypt for centuries, where the pharaohs will mirrored the cosmos, was unraveling thread by thread. At the center of this decline stood Pepi II, a boy who became a god-king too early and ruled for far too long. According to ancient records, Pepi II's reign may have lasted more than 90 years, making him the longest reigning monarch in all of human history. When he ascended the throne as a child, Egypt was still unified, prosperous, and radiant under the last light of the Old Kingdom. But as decades passed, the balance between throne, temple, and province began to shift slowly, then catastrophically. The erosion of power in the beginning. The young king ruled through powerful viziers and royal mothers who managed the machinery of state. Yet with each generation, Egypt's nomarchs, the governors of provincial regions, consolidated power that once belonged solely to the crown. They passed their offices to their sons, fortified their local authority, and began to rule their territories as miniature kingdoms. The temples, too, grew wealthy and autonomous. Land grants once given to honor the gods became vast estates exempt from royal taxes, draining the treasury. The pharaoh, once the living link between heaven and earth, now presided over a realm increasingly ruled by bureaucracy, local dynasties, and priests, a kingdom of drought and division. At the same time, nature itself turned against Egypt. The Nile's annual flood, source of all life, became erratic and insufficient. Low inundations led to poor harvests, famine, and unrest. Trade routes through Sinai and Nubia faltered under Bedouin raids, cutting off supplies of copper, gold, and incense. The court in Memphis grew weak, disconnected from the suffering of its people. While provincial lords hoarded resources to survive the scarcity, the pharaoh who outlived his world, Pepi II, once a symbol of divine endurance, became instead a mirror of stagnation. The same longevity that might have been a blessing became a curse. As he aged, the court ossified around him. Younger generations knew no Egypt without Pepi, and yet his power was little more than ceremonial. The divine monarch, who once a living force, had become a ritual without substance. By the time of his death, the machinery of central rule had broken beyond repair. The northern provinces ignored Memphis. Local rulers issued decrees in their own names, and the idea of one Egypt gave way to many. The Old Kingdom, an era that had raised the Great Pyramid and mastered the stone, collapsed not in conquest, but in quiet decay. Into darkness after Pepi II's death, the kingdom splintered. Famine, rivalry, and isolation marked the dawn of the first intermediate period, when Egypt's great cities became fortresses of survival, and local warlords replaced divine kings. The priests no longer spoke with one voice, and the sun temples grew cold. Yet even in collapse, Egypt did not vanish. Beneath the dust of disunity, the memory of cosmic balance and justice remained. And one day, new pharaohs would rise again to restore the two lands. The Old Kingdom had fallen, but the spirit of Egypt's will to endure had merely withdrawn into silence, waiting to be reborn. Middle Kingdom restored. Mentuhotep II. Out of the ruins of the Old Kingdom's collapse and a century of chaos, a new dawn rose from the south. From Thebes, a city that had once been a provincial stronghold, emerged a ruler who would reunite the two lands and reserve Egypt's spirit. Mentuhotep II, founder of the Middle Kingdom and one of the greatest statesmen in ancient history. The war to reunite the two lands for nearly 100 years. Egypt had been divided between rival powers. In the north, the Heracleopolitan kings claimed to rule as heirs of the Old Kingdom, while in the south, Theban princes held their own domain, guided by a fierce belief in divine legitimacy. The land was fractured, trade disrupted, and famine commonplace. Mentuhotep II inherited this divided realm and chose the path of unity. What followed was a 20-year civil war, fought across the Nile Valley along bitter struggle of sieges, shifting alliances, and slow attrition. The Thebans marched northward, advancing step by step through Middle Egypt. Finally, around 2055 BC, Mentuhotep triumphed, overthrowing the northern dynasty and reuniting Upper and Lower Egypt under one crown. His victory ended the first intermediate period and began an age historians would later call the Middle Kingdom, an era not only of political stability, but of renewed cultural depth, administrative reform, and artistic introspection. The rebirth of the state. Mentuhotep understood that mere conquest could not hold Egypt together. To prevent future collapse, he rebuilt the machinery of the state from the ground up. Local governors, nomarchs, were brought under tighter royal control. Military organization was strengthened, and Egypt's borders were resecured with new fortresses in Nubia, ensuring a steady flow of gold, ivory, and exotic goods. He also restructured the bureaucracy, placing loyal officials in key positions and reviving the ideal of centralized kingship. The lesson of the Old Kingdom's decline was clear. Divine power alone could not sustain empire. Administrative competence must accompany sacred authority. A new image of the pharaoh, art, and ideology changed under Mentuhotep's rule. Gone were the serene, idealized portraits of eternal youth that had defined the Old Kingdom. The king was now depicted as human, thoughtful, burdened by the weight of duty. His statues show him with furrowed brows, heavy eyes, and a powerful but weary face, an image of a ruler who had fought not only wars, but chaos itself. This aesthetic marked a philosophical shift. The pharaoh was no longer merely a god among mortals, but a mortal chosen to uphold divine order, a man who bore the pain of his people and the fatigue of leadership. The Middle Kingdom thus inaugurated a new spiritual realism, reverence tempered with empathy, divinity grounded in humanity. Legacy of renewal of Mentuhotep II's reign lasted over half a century, long enough to heal the scars of disunity and restore Egypt's confidence. His mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built in terraces against the cliffs of western Thebes, became the architectural precursor to later masterpieces, including that of Queen Hatshepsut centuries later. In him, Egypt found not just a conqueror, but a restorer, pharaoh who rebuilt faith in the concept of kingship itself. Under his rule, the two lands were not simply reunited. They were reconciled, their spirits harmonized after a century of division, and from that harmony arose a civilization renewed, one that would shine once more, not with the youthful brilliance of the Old Kingdom, but with the measured light of wisdom hard-won through suffering. Apex of the Middle Kingdom. Senusret III. If Mentuhotep II restored Egypt's unity, Senusret III perfected its strength. Reigning from 1878 to 1839 BC, he transformed the Middle Kingdom into a disciplined, expansionist, and unmistakably centralized empire. Under his rule, the pharaoh was not merely a divine intermediary, he became the embodiment of state power itself, an image of control, vigilance, and endurance. The Iron Pharaoh Senusret III's portraits are among the most striking in Egyptian art. Gone are the youthful serenity and otherworldly perfection of earlier kings. His statues show a ruler with lined cheeks, drooping eyes, and a hardened expression, a man shaped by the weight of command. This realism was deliberate. It projected the image of a stern, battle-tested monarch, a leader whose strength came from discipline, not divinity alone. Later generations revered him not just as a king but as a cultural archetype. In Abydos, centuries after his death, people still worshipped him as a demigod, a ruler whose authority had transcended mortality, breaking the power of the provinces. Senusret III recognized that Egypt's greatest threat came not from abroad but from within. The semi-independent nomarchs, who had once defied royal authority, were systematically stripped of their power. Provincial offices were brought under direct royal control, and administration was reorganized into centralized hierarchies answerable only to the crown. This reform was a turning point. The pharaoh's word once again became absolute across the two lands. Egypt was no longer a patchwork of regional powers but a unified machine of state, capable of commanding vast labor forces and executing long-term military and engineering projects. The southern frontier and imperial vision, Senusret III, was not content with internal control. He looked beyond Egypt's borders. To the south, in Nubia, he waged a series of aggressive campaigns to secure the gold mines, quarries, and trade routes that supplied the kingdom's wealth. Along the Nile, he built a chain of massive fortresses, including Buin, Semna, and Urinnati, architectural marvels of military precision. These were not mere outposts. They were symbols of permanence, each one a statement that Egyptian order extended deep into the lands of chaos. The walls were high, the gates monumental, and inscriptions warned, "No Nubian shall pass this point, except to trade or serve." To the north and east, Senusret's forces ventured into Canaan and Syria, asserting Egypt's influence over key trade corridors. His reign marked one of the first moments when Egypt began to behave like a true empire, securing distant borders and projecting power across continents. Death and dual tombs, the pharaoh's preparation for eternity was as strategic as his governance. Archaeologists have found multiple tombs attributed to him, one at Djoser, another at Abydos. Whether this duality served religious symbolism or political messaging remains debated. Perhaps one burial was practical, and the other spiritual, the way to anchor his soul both in the heart of Egypt and in the sacred city of Osiris. Legacy of power and order. Senusret III's reign was the apex of the Middle Kingdom, a time when the state was both efficient and visionary, when its art reflected maturity, and its borders reached their widest extent in centuries. He redefined kingship, no longer distant and divine, but present, formidable, and deeply human. His successors inherited a realm of stability and pride, an empire confident in its strength. Long after his tombs fell silent, Senusret's image, that furrowed brow and unyielding gaze, remained the model of the perfect Egyptian ruler, the living symbol of power tempered by purpose. Foreign rule and imperial rebirth. Hyksos and Ahmose I, the centuries following the Middle Kingdom saw Egypt's long peace shattered. Foreign rulers known as the Hyksos, Asiatic warlords from the Levant, took control of the northern delta, establishing their capital at Avaris. They brought with them new technologies that would change Egyptian warfare forever: the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, and advanced bronze weaponry. For over a century, native Egyptian kings in Thebes ruled only the south, their independence reduced to ritual sovereignty beneath foreign shadow. The age of occupation, the Hyksos, though invaders, did not merely destroy, they assimilated. They adopted Egyptian titles, worshipped Egyptian gods, and maintained a semblance of Egyptian kingship. Yet their presence in the delta was a constant insult to Thebes, where the 17th dynasty pharaohs, descendants of Mentuhotep, vowed to restore the purity of the two lands. The air of humiliation and resistance gave rise to a new kind of nationalism, a spiritual and military awakening that would reshape Egypt's destiny. The rise of Ahmose. Out of this crucible of occupation rose Ahmose I, a young Theban prince who would become Egypt's liberator. Building on the campaigns of his forebears Seqenenre and Ahmose, Ahmose reorganized Egypt's fragmented forces into a professional standing army, the first in its history. He also created a naval fleet capable of transporting troops and blockading enemy strongholds along the Nile Delta. With discipline and strategy replacing desperation, Ahmose led a series of decisive assaults on Avaris, the Hyksos capital. The siege was long and brutal. Ancient accounts describe the capture of the city's walls and the relentless pursuit of the fleeing Hyksos into southern Canaan, ensuring they would never again threaten Egypt's sovereignty. Birth of the new kingdom. Ahmose's victory around 1550 BC did more than end foreign rule. It inaugurated the new kingdom, Egypt's golden age of empire. The pharaohs were no longer content with defense. They became conquerors, viewing expansion as both divine mandate and strategic necessity. The army and navy that had been forged in liberation now carried Egypt's banners deep into Nubia, the Levant, and beyond, securing borders and wealth unprecedented in earlier ages. Legacy of renewal of Ahmose I not only expelled the Hyksos but rebuilt the kingdom's infrastructure, reopened trade routes, and restored temples desecrated during foreign rule. His reign symbolized rebirth through struggle, a transformation from isolation into imperial vision. He became, in essence, the prototype of the new kingdom, pharaoh, warrior, builder, and divine unifier. The once humbled Theban dynasty had remade Egypt into the strongest empire of the ancient world, its confidence reborn from the ashes of invasion. From the age of humiliation rose an age of glory. The two lands, scarred but unbroken, entered a new era, an empire of light born out of the darkness of foreign rule. Hatshepsut, a woman on the throne among the long line of Egypt's divine rulers. Hatshepsut stands as one of the most extraordinary and enigmatic. Rising first as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, she soon took the unprecedented step of proclaiming herself pharaoh, not queen consort, not co-regent, but the sole sovereign of the two lands. Her reign c. 1479 to 1458 BC would become one of peace, prosperity, and architectural splendor, challenging both political custom and theological convention. The divine right to rule in a society where kingship was divinely masculine. Hatshepsut's ascension demanded more than ambition, it required cosmic justification. To legitimize her rule, she invoked the god Ammon, claiming he had visited her mother in divine form, fathering a child destined for the throne. Through this theology of divine birth, she redefined gender within sacred kingship. The goddess within her became the god incarnate on earth. Artists depicted her as a man wearing the royal kilt, the false beard, and the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, yet inscriptions still referred to her with feminine pronouns. It was a delicate fusion of form and essence, a woman embodying a male god, without denying her own identity, governance, and vision. Hatshepsut's reign was marked not by conquest, but by stability and diplomacy. She restored temples neglected during earlier reigns, reorganized administration, and reopened long-dormant trade routes. Egypt flourished economically under her rule. Prosperity replaced war as the measure of divine favor. Her most celebrated achievement was the expedition to Punt, a distant land along the Red Sea, possibly in modern Eritrea or Somalia. Reliefs at her mortuary temple show fleets of ships returning laden with gold, ivory, ebony, incense trees, and exotic animals, symbols of abundance and divine harmony. For Hatshepsut, trade was not merely commerce. It was ritual exchange, restoring the sacred balance between Egypt and the wider world. The Temple of Eternity of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, carved into the cliffs of western Thebes, remains one of the architectural masterpieces of ancient Egypt. Designed by her steward and possible confidant Senusret, it was conceived as a bridge between earth and heaven, a sequence of terraces, colonnades, and sanctuaries rising toward the desert cliffs. The temple's reliefs immortalize her divine birth, coronation, and the triumph of her reign. The structure itself mirrors her political vision, order, symmetry, and renewal, a visual hymn to the principle of net cosmic balance, erasure, and immortality. After Hatshepsut's death, her stepson and successor Thutmose III ordered a systematic removal of her images and names from monuments. Statues were smashed, reliefs chiseled out, and her cartouches erased from king lists. This was not mere revenge, it was likely an effort to erase the precedent of female kingship, to preserve the divine order that identified rule with masculine power. Yet history defied the chisel. The grandeur of Deir el-Bahri, the inscriptions on obelisks at Karnak, and the echoes of her name in temple walls ensured her memory endured. The woman who once wore the beard of a king remains a symbol of intelligence, will, and vision, a sovereign who proved that legitimacy could arise not from bloodline or gender, but from the courage to embody divine purpose. I have raised up what was fallen. I have restored what was ruined. I have made Egypt as it was in the beginning. Inscription of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri. The Amarna Revolution, Akhenaten, and Nefertiti. A few chapters in Egyptian history radiate as much mystery and controversy as the reign of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. What began as a theological reform became a cultural upheaval, the most radical experiment in the entire ancient world. The birth of a heresy born as Imhotep IV. The pharaoh initially ruled within the familiar pantheon of Thebes, honoring Amun and the great temples of Karnak. But something shifted, perhaps a revelation, perhaps a revolt against the entrenched power of the Amun priesthood. He exalted Aten, the visible disk of the sun, as the sole divine force, the giver of life to all things. Under his decree, the old gods were silenced, their temples closed, their priests dismissed. Renaming himself Akhenaten, he who acts for the Aten, he moved the royal court from Thebes to a new, untainted capital, Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, known today as Amarna. There, amid cliffs and desert light, he built a city like no other, open temples without roofs, sanctuaries without shadows, where sunlight itself became the medium of worship. A new religion and a new art. Under Akhenaten, religion merged with sunlight and visibility. Rituals were conducted beneath the open sky, offerings raised to the glowing disk whose rays ended in tiny hands blessing the royal family. Atenism was not abstract theology, it was a sensual religion of light and breath, of immediacy over mystery. Art followed faith. The rigid formalism of earlier dynasties dissolved into fluid, intimate realism, elongated heads, narrow faces. Tender scenes of the pharaoh and Nefertiti playing with their daughters beneath Aten's rays. The royal family became the axis of the universe, the sole intermediaries between humanity and the divine. In this art, we glimpse something almost modern: vulnerability, affection, and the human face of godhood. Yet to the priestly elite and traditionalists, it was blasphemy, decline and isolation. While Akhenaten's eyes were turned heavenward, the empire beneath him began to crumble. Egypt's vassal states in Syria and Canaan sent desperate letters, and Amarna letters, pleading for aid against invaders and rebellious princes. Most went unanswered. The once mighty Egyptian diplomacy faltered as the pharaoh's attention was consumed by theology and art. Inside Egypt, resentment festered. The closure of Amun's temples crippled the economic and spiritual lifelines of the kingdom. The populace, long accustomed to many gods, found Aten's singularity alien and austere. The aftermath and mystery. After Akhenaten's death, the revolution collapsed with astonishing speed. Akhenaten was abandoned, its temples left to sand and silence. The old gods returned. The priests of Amun regained their power. His successors, perhaps Menkaure, Nefertiti under another name, and finally Tutankhamun, soon renamed Tutankhamun, restored the traditional pantheon. Akhenaten's monuments were defaced, his name struck from king lists, his memory officially condemned. For later Egyptians, he was the heretic king, the ruler who had offended the gods themselves. Legacy of light, yet across millennia, Akhenaten and Nefertiti remain haunting figures, rebels, visionaries, or mystics ahead of their time. Some see in Atenism the world's first experiment with monotheism. Others, a tragic delusion that nearly unmade Egypt. The ruins of Amarna still hold questions. Was Akhenaten a philosopher king or a zealot? Did Nefertiti rule after him as a hidden pharaoh? Where do their true remains lie? What endures is the vision, sunlight on stone, faces turned upward. A family beneath a radiant god, a fragile, luminous dream that flickered for 17 years, then vanished, leaving behind only the memory of a kingdom bathed in eternal light. Tutankhamun, a short life, immortal tomb. A few names from antiquity shine as brightly as Tutankhamun, the boy king whose death became the world's greatest resurrection in history. His reign was brief, barely a decade, and his accomplishments modest compared to the vast empires built by his forebears. Yet fate ensured that in death, his story would outlast them all. The child of restoration, born Tutankhamun, living image of the Aten, the young prince was almost certainly a son of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, and possibly Nefertiti or one of her kin. When his father's religious revolution collapsed, priests and generals sought a symbolic heir who could restore order. At about 9 years old, the boy ascended the throne, renamed himself Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, and reopened the temples of the ancient gods. Under the guidance of powerful courtiers like A and Horemheb, the young pharaoh's reign became a time of reconciliation. The court moved back to Thebes, the name of Amun returned to royal inscriptions, and Aten's sun discs were quietly chipped away from temple walls. The empire was healing from its spiritual fracture. Even if true power rested in the hands of regents and priests, the fragility of a king, Tutankhamun's health was delicate. His lineage had been narrowed by generations of royal inbreeding. Modern CT scans and DNA analyses reveal congenital deformities, a club foot, cleft palate, and bone necrosis in the left leg. These ailments, combined with a severe leg fracture likely sustained shortly before death, led to infection and an untimely end around the age of 18 or 19. Earlier theories of murder or conspiracy popularized by 20th century dramatizations have largely been dismissed. Science paints a more tragic picture, not a royal intrigue, but the quiet mortality of a frail youth burdened with divine expectation, the tomb that time forgot in death. The boy king received a burial far smaller than his station deserved, perhaps because he died suddenly, and a grander tomb was not yet ready. His sepulchre, now known as KV62 in the Valley of the Kings, was likely intended for a lesser noble. Yet this modest space became the greatest time capsule of the ancient world. For over 3,000 years, shifting sands and debris from nearby excavations concealed the entrance. Grave robbers passed it by. In 1922, when Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon broke through its sealed doorway, the light of their candles fell upon a golden vision. "Wonderful things," Carter whispered. Inside lay over 5,000 artifacts, from chariots and weapons to jewelry, statues, and ritual objects, all perfectly preserved. At the heart of the nested shrines, wrapped in layers of linen and gold, rested the king's serene death mask, one of humanity's most iconic images. Immortality through discovery. Though Tutankhamun's life had been brief and his reign unremarkable, his tomb transformed him into a legend. For modern archaeology, the discovery was a turning point, a glimpse into the undisturbed world of Egypt's golden age. For the wider world, it ignited a wave of fascination, the so-called Egyptomania that reshaped art, fashion, and imagination throughout the 20th century. Tutankhamun never built empires, conquered nations, or carved vast temples into cliffs. Yet his legacy eclipsed that of the greatest pharaohs. In the stillness of his chamber, surrounded by gold and eternity, the boy who restored the gods achieved what all kings sought: immortality. Death is but the doorway to new life. We live today because we have built forever. Ramesses II Monument and Memory. Ramesses II, known to later ages as Ramesses the Great, ruled Egypt for more than 6 decades, 1279 to 1213 BC. It was spent so long that generations were born, lived, and died under his name. His reign became the high noon of Egypt's imperial might, a synthesis of power, art, and propaganda that turned kingship itself into a monument. The warrior and the myth. Ramesses' early years were dominated by his struggle against the Hittite Empire, culminating in the legendary Battle of Kadesh, 1274 BC. The clash was fierce, chaotic, and nearly catastrophic. Egypt's armies barely escaped destruction. Yet Ramesses transformed near defeat into eternal triumph. In temple reliefs from Abu Simbel to Karnak, he is shown as a divine hero, charging alone into battle, trampling enemies as Ammon guides his chariot. The truth was more complex. The war ended in a stalemate, followed years later by the world's first recorded peace treaty, inscribed on temple walls and mirrored in Hittite archives. It marked a rare moment in antiquity when diplomacy triumphed over conquest. The builder of eternity, Ramesses' genius lay not only in war, but in memory-making. His reign saw a frenzy of construction unequaled since the Pyramid Age. He expanded Karnak and Luxor, built new temples at Abydos and Pyramesses, and ordered colossal statues that merge his visage with divine perfection. Most spectacular were the twin temples of Abu Simbel, carved directly into the cliffs of Nubia. For colossal seated figures of Ramesses, each over 20 meters high, gaze eternally toward the rising sun. Inside, the alignment of the inner sanctuary ensures that twice a year, the sun's rays illuminate the pharaoh's statue, affirming his union with the cosmos. For Ramesses, architecture was theology, each monument a prayer in stone, declaring that kingship is eternal because it is divine. The pharaoh as god and father, Ramesses fathered over 100 children and elevated his beloved queen Nefertari to near divine status. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens, adorned with luminous murals, is a masterpiece of New Kingdom art, its colors still radiant after 3,000 years. Through such works, Ramesses wove family, state, and religion into a single image of harmony. Egypt under his rule stood as a living myth, where the pharaoh's bloodline mirrored the order of heaven. The afterlife of a king. Centuries passed, dynasties fell, and empires vanished, but Ramesses' presence endured. His colossal statues were mistaken by later civilizations for the images of forgotten gods. The Greek historian Diodorus called him Ozymandias, the name immortalized by Shelley's haunting poem Look on My Works, Ye Mighty, and Despair. Even in the modern age, Ramesses' legend continued. When his mummy was sent to Paris in 1976 for conservation, Egypt issued him an official passport, listing his occupation as king deceased. He received a royal welcome at the airport, complete with military honors, an extraordinary gesture to a man dead for over 3 millennia. Legacy of immortality. Ramesses II ruled longer than most civilizations last. His monuments dot Egypt from the Delta to Nubia. His image is carved into the very definition of kingship. More than any pharaoh before or after, he understood the power of memory as immortality. Through war and peace, through granite and sunlight, he shaped how history remembers not just Egypt, but the human desire to endure. I built for the ages. My shadow will stand when the sun has set on all others. Ramesses III and the Sea Peoples of Victory amid decline. By the 12th century BC, the empire forged by Ramesses II had begun to strain under its own weight. Foreign pressures mounted, harvests waned, and distant colonies slipped away. Into this age of turbulence stepped Ramesses III, the last of the great warrior pharaohs, a ruler who fought not to expand Egypt's borders, but to defend its very survival. The storm from the sea and from the Mediterranean swept a confederation of displaced tribes, the Sea Peoples, whose migrations toppled empires from Anatolia to the Levant. They were not a single nation but a storm of humanity, warriors, families, entire peoples driven by famine and collapse across the Aegean world. Their fleet struck like thunder on Egypt's northern frontier. Ramesses III, drawing on his father's legacy of power and his own strategic acumen, organized the kingdom's first true naval defense. He fortified the delta's mouths, built watchtowers and supply depots, and arrayed fleets along the coast. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, his mortuary temple near Thebes, immortalized the battle, Egyptian ships locking with invaders, archers loosing volleys, enemy vessels overturned as the Nile runs red. It was one of antiquity's earliest recorded naval victories, and it saved Egypt from the fate that befell so many others. Victory and the price of survival. Though victorious, Egypt emerged weakened. The campaigns drained the treasury, foreign trade routes faltered, and tribute from vassal states diminished. Grain shortages and inflation followed, sparking internal unrest. In an extraordinary episode, the artisans and tomb builders of Deir al-Medina, who served the royal necropolis, laid down their tools in protest, recorded on papyri as the world's first known labor strike. Meanwhile, court intrigues multiplied. Harem politics turned deadly as secondary wives plotted to place their own sons on the throne. The so-called harem conspiracy erupted within the palace itself. Forensics on Ramesses III's mummy reveal his throat was cut, likely in the coup attempt. Judicial records show the conspirators royal women, officials. Guards were tried and executed by the prince who would become Ramesses IV. The twilight of an empire. Ramesses III's reign 1186 to 1155 BC was a final flare of greatness before decline. Egypt survived the sea peoples and internal chaos, but its golden age was over. Provincial autonomy grew, temples hoarded wealth, and the centralized state eroded. Yet his monuments, especially Medinet Habu, remain a stone chronicle of that fading light. Its walls proclaim the glory of a kingdom that could still command the gods of war and sea. Even as time began to slip away, he defeated chaos at the gates, yet within, the sand had already begun to rise. The third intermediate period, Shoshenq I. After the grandeur of the New Kingdom, Egypt entered a long twilight. The third intermediate period, c. 1070 to 660 for BC, an age of fragmentation, foreign rulers, and fading divine kingship. The central authority of the pharaohs fractured. The once unified land was now divided between north and south, temple and throne, memory and survival. The age of division in Thebes. Powerful high priests of Ammon ruled the south as spiritual monarchs, controlling immense temple estates and wealth. Their authority rivaled that of any king. Meanwhile, in the Delta, Libyan chieftains, descendants of foreign mercenaries who had settled in Egypt generations earlier, rose to prominence. They adopted Egyptian titles and rituals, blending foreign vigor with local tradition. Amid this divided realm emerged Shoshenq I, c. 943 to 922 BC, founder of the 22nd dynasty, a Libyan by ancestry but Egyptian by ambition. A former military commander, he managed to reunify much of Egypt under his rule, restoring stability and royal dignity for a time. His reign marked a brief but genuine renaissance of pharaonic authority. The biblical pharaoh Shoshenq's name echoes in another history, that of the Hebrew Bible, where he appears as Shishak, the king who invaded Judah during the reign of Rehoboam, Solomon's son. The Book of Kings describes him plundering the treasures of the temple in Jerusalem. At Karnak, Shoshenq immortalized his northern campaigns in monumental reliefs, processions of bound Canaanite city-states, hieroglyphs naming dozens of captured towns. Whether Jerusalem was among them remains debated. Its name is missing from the surviving inscriptions, but his campaign was Egypt's last great military venture into Egypt. It signaled a flicker of former imperial pride. Before the torch went out, the slow unraveling. After Shoshenq's death, Egypt once again splintered. Regional dynasties reasserted themselves, temple power swelled, and the pharaohs retreated. The Nile no longer flowed through one empire, but through many small kingdoms, each claiming divine sanction, none possessing it fully. This was a time when Egypt still looked grand but no longer believed in its eternity. The monuments stood, but their builders had lost the thread of destiny. And yet, even in decline, the Egyptian spirit endured, refusing to vanish, only changing form, as it had for millennia. The gods grow silent, the kings grow small, but the Nile remembers. Sate revival of Psamtik I Samitichus by the mid-7th century BC. After centuries of division and foreign domination, Egypt stirred once more. The Assyrian Empire, which had loomed over the Near East with iron and fire, began to wane. In that brief opening of history, a new pharaoh rose from the delta city of Psamtik, or Samitichus, and with him came Egypt's final renaissance before the shadow of empire returned. A pragmatic unifier, Psamtik I 660–610 BC was both realist and visionary. Trained in a world of fractured loyalties, he understood that unity required more than divine claim, it required strategy. With a blend of diplomacy, military force, and foreign alliances, he achieved what few before him could, the reunification of Egypt under one crown. He courted the support of Assyria, then turned against it when the balance of power shifted. He recruited Greek and Carian mercenaries, settling them in Naucratis, a port city in the western delta that became a vibrant hub of trade and cultural exchange. For the first time, Greece and Egypt met not as myth but as reality, philosophers and traders crossing paths where the Nile met the sea. A return to order and identity. Psamtik's rule inaugurated the 26th dynasty, often called the Sate Renaissance, a deliberate revival of Egypt's ancient forms. Art and architecture returned to Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom styles, idealized pharaohs, hieroglyphic precision, the rebirth of classical statuary. This was not imitation, but cultural restoration, a nation remembering its own sacred grammar. Temples once again thrived, but Psamtik kept them balanced under royal oversight, curbing the excesses of priestly autonomy that had fractured earlier dynasties. The economy stabilized, the bureaucracy revived, and Egypt, after centuries of foreign interference, stood independent once more. The world beyond the Nile, yet beyond Egypt's secure borders, a new storm gathered. The Neo-Babylonians were rising under Nebuchadnezzar II, while in the east, the Persians were uniting under Cyrus the Great. Egypt's revival, for all its brilliance, was brief, a golden dusk before the Persian dawn. Still, the reign of Psamtik glowed with quiet triumph. For nearly half a century, Egypt breathed as a sovereign kingdom, again trading, building, dreaming. The Sate period scholars and artisans would pass Egypt's memory westward, influencing the early Greek thinkers who would shape Western civilization itself. When the old gods fade, the wise rebuild their temples not for worship but for remembrance. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh. By the time Cleopatra VII ascended the throne in 51 BC, Egypt had become both rich and precarious, a jewel desired by empires, a kingdom surviving through diplomacy as much as divinity. She was the last in the Ptolemaic line, the Greek heirs of Alexander the Great, yet unlike her predecessors, Cleopatra sought to be more than a foreign queen ruling an Egyptian land. She learned the Egyptian language, embraced native customs, and portrayed herself as the living embodiment of Isis, goddess of life and sovereignty, the queen and the world. Brilliant, multilingual, and politically astute, Cleopatra understood that survival depended on alliances beyond the Nile. She first aligned with Julius Caesar, whose legions restored her throne amid the violent Alexandrian War. Their union, political and personal, produced a son, Caesarion, whom she declared co-ruler and heir. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra turned to Mark Antony, one of Rome's triumvirs. Together they envisioned a reborn Hellenistic empire, Rome of the East, with Alexandria as its luminous capital. Their love and ambition intertwined, symbolizing the meeting of East and West, goddess and general, myth and history. The fall at Actium, but Rome could not tolerate two sons. Octavian, the future Augustus, framed their alliance as treason, a queen's enchantment of a Roman hero. In 31 BC, their fleets met in the fateful Battle of Actium. Outmaneuvered and betrayed by shifting winds and loyalties, Antony and Cleopatra's forces fell. They fled to Egypt, now besieged and doomed. In the shadow of the dying empire, Antony fell on his sword, and Cleopatra, choosing dignity over humiliation, took her own life. Ancient tradition tells of the asp, the sacred cobra, striking her breast. Others suggest poison or a hidden blade. However it happened, her death marked the end of 3,000 years of pharaonic rule, the end of an era, the birth of a legend. When Octavian entered Alexandria, Egypt became a Roman province, its temples and treasures now under imperial command. Yet Cleopatra transcended defeat. To the Romans, she was the dangerous seductress. To the Egyptians, the last true pharaoh. To posterity, the eternal queen, whose intellect, courage, and mythic grace bridge to worlds, empires fall. But the image of the queen endures, the woman who chose death not as escape, but as sovereignty. Epilogue. Names that live in stone across more than 3,000 years, the pharaohs of Egypt sought not power alone, but eternity. Their reigns were not merely moments in time, they were attempts to carve time itself into permanence. From Narmer, who bound the two lands under one crown, to Sneferu, who learned to build mountains of stone, from Khufu's perfect geometry that touched the sky, to Hatshepsut's terraces rising like prayers above the desert, from Akhenaten's sunlit revolution to Tutankhamun's silent tomb, found and touched after millennia. Each ruler spoke a different dialect of the same yearning to make the transient endure. The line continued. Ramesses II, whose colossal image became the very face of empire. Ramesses III, who fought the sea peoples but could not defeat betrayal. Shashangai, who carried Egypt's banners into the Levant one last time. Somdetchai, who rekindled the flame of an ancient order. And Cleopatra VII, who stood against the tide of Rome and chose death as her final act of sovereignty. Their world was one of grandeur and undoing, of creation and collapse, of cosmic order forever pursued yet never perfectly held. Each dynasty rose to restore that balance, and each, in turn, gave way to the desert's quiet patience. But though empires fall and languages fade, stone remembers. The cartouches etched into limestone, the eyes of statues still glinting beneath the sand. The hieroglyphs that whisper under torchlight all remain, speaking across the abyss of time. Empires are mortal, but memory is not. The pharaohs do not sleep, they dream in stone.